Number 1. The Brinks Mat robbery. A gold heist that sparked a decade of violence. The Brinks Mat robbery, carried out on November 26, 1983, at a warehouse near Heathrow Airport in London, England, began as what the perpetrators intended to be a straightforward cash robbery but became one of the most consequential and violent criminal enterprises in British history when the six-man gang that entered the warehouse that morning discovered not the £3 million in cash they had expected but instead approximately 6,800 gold bars weighing nearly 3 tons and valued at approximately £26 million, a discovery that transformed what might have been a contained criminal event into a sprawling underworld operation whose violent consequences continued to ripple through British organized crime for more than a decade. The robbery was planned with inside assistance from a security guard named Anthony Black, whose brother-in-law Brian Robinson was one of the gang's leaders alongside Mickey McAvoy, and it was Black's inside knowledge of the warehouse layout, security procedures, and the timing of cash deliveries that gave the robbers confidence the operation was viable. What Black had not known, and what no one in the planning phase had anticipated, was that the warehouse would contain an extraordinary quantity of gold bullion from a recent delivery that had not been part of any information available to the gang when they planned the job. When the robbers entered and discovered the scale of what was actually available, McAvoy reportedly told the security guards they were the luckiest men alive, referring to the fortune they had stumbled upon, though the guards themselves, who were subjected to significant physical intimidation including having petrol poured over them and being threatened with being set on fire, likely did not share this assessment of their luck. The gold presented an enormous practical problem in addition to an enormous windfall, because moving and laundering nearly 3 tons of bullion was exponentially more complex than moving cash, and the gang's connections were not sufficient on their own to accomplish this, necessitating the involvement of a much wider network of handlers, fences, and money launderers whose participation created a sprawling criminal enterprise with numerous potential points of vulnerability and conflict. Robinson and McAvoy were caught and convicted in 1984 and sentenced to 25 years in prison each, but the gold itself, the vast majority of which was never recovered, continued to be smelted, laundered, and distributed through criminal networks for years afterward, financing further criminal activity and generating the conflicts over shares, proceeds, and control that resulted in a string of murders across the British underworld throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s. Kenneth Noye, who became one of the most significant figures in the laundering of the Brinks Mat gold, was connected to the stabbing death of an undercover police officer, John Fordham, in 1985, and was acquitted of that killing on a claim of self-defense before later being convicted of a separate road rage murder in 1996. One of the most famous violent incidents in British criminal history of that period. The total death toll attributed to conflicts arising from the Brinks Mat gold has been estimated at various points at more than a dozen individuals, as disputes over shares and proceeds generated violence across the networks involved in moving and profiting from the stolen bullion. Most of the gold was never recovered, and the case remains one of the most studied examples in British criminal history of how a single criminal event can generate cascading consequences far beyond anything its perpetrators could have anticipated. Number 2. The Lufthansa heist. The crime that Goodfellas made famous. The Lufthansa heist at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York City on December 11, 1978, which netted approximately $5 million in cash and approximately $800,000 in jewelry from a Lufthansa Airlines cargo facility, was at the time the largest cash robbery in American history and became one of the most celebrated criminal events in organized crime lore, largely through its depiction in Nicholas Pileggi's book Wise Guy and Martin Scorsese's subsequent film Goodfellas. The robbery was organized by James Burke, known in the Lucchese crime family as Jimmy the Gent, with inside information provided by Louis Werner, a Lufthansa cargo agent who was aware of the facility's security procedures and the timing of large cash shipments. The robbery itself was carried out by a team of approximately 8 men using an airport security van to gain access to the cargo building, with the crew overpowering and restraining employees and making off with their haul within approximately an hour. The aftermath of the robbery was substantially more violent than the robbery itself, as Burke, apparently concerned about the number of individuals who had knowledge of the operation and could potentially cooperate with law enforcement, began systematically eliminating those involved. Richard Eaton, Parnell Edwards, Paolo Licastri, Teresa Ferrara, and others connected to the heist were murdered in the months following the robbery, with their bodies in some cases disposed of in ways designed to delay identification. Stax Edwards, one of the participants, was murdered for buying a new Cadillac against Burke's explicit instructions to avoid any conspicuous spending that might attract law enforcement attention. The investigation into the Lufthansa heist and the subsequent murders was conducted by FBI agents, including those who were simultaneously working with Henry Hill, a Lucchese associate who eventually became one of the most significant government informants in the history of organized crime investigations and whose testimony helped prosecutors build cases against numerous individuals. Burke was eventually convicted not of the Lufthansa robbery itself, for which insufficient evidence existed for prosecution, but of a separate murder, and died in prison in 1996. Werner was convicted of his role in facilitating the robbery. The case illustrated with brutal clarity how the internal logic of organized crime enterprises, in which eliminating witnesses is perceived as rational risk management, can transform a property crime into a series of murders as perpetrators attempt to contain the exposure that any large-scale criminal operation inevitably generates. Number 3. The Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Burglary. Britain's biggest peacetime heist. The Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Burglary, carried out over the Easter weekend of April 2015 in London's Jewellery District, was remarkable not only for the scale of the theft, estimated at between £10 and £200 million depending on the valuation method applied, but for the extraordinary age of the perpetrators, a group of career criminals mostly in their 60s and 70s who had been active in London's underworld for decades and who referred to themselves in recorded conversations as the best burglars in the world. The gang drilled through a vault wall over multiple nights, accessed hundreds of safety deposit boxes belonging to Hatton Garden customers, and made off with an enormous quantity of jewelry, cash, diamonds, and other valuables. The heist itself did not involve direct violence, but the investigation and prosecution that followed revealed the full scope of a criminal network that had, over the perpetrators' long careers, been associated with serious violence and other major crimes. Brian Reeder, considered the architect of the plan though he withdrew before the actual burglary nights due to health concerns, had a criminal history stretching back decades, including a connection to the Brinks Mat gold laundering network. Terry Perkins, John Collins, Daniel Jones, and Carl Wood were among those convicted for their roles in the burglary. The investigation made use of covert surveillance, telephone intercepts, and the inadvertent assistance of the gang members themselves, who were recorded discussing the burglary and the disposal of the proceeds in conversations captured by police after the robbery. While the Hatton Garden case itself did not directly result in murder, its connection to a network of individuals with histories of serious violence and its intersection with London's broader organized crime landscape illustrated the continuum along which property crime and violent crime coexist within professional criminal enterprises, and it is included here as an example of a major heist operation embedded within a criminal world where the potential for violence is always present even when a specific operation is carried out without direct physical harm to victims. Number 4. The Gardner Museum Heist. An unsolved art theft and its violent connections. The theft of 13 works of art from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, Massachusetts, on March 18, 1990, remains the largest art theft in recorded history, with the stolen works, including paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Degas, and Manet, estimated to be worth in excess of $500 million at current valuations. Two men posing as police officers gained entry to the museum in the early morning hours by claiming to be responding to a disturbance call, convinced the two security guards on duty to open the door, handcuffed and duct-taped the guards, and methodically removed paintings and other works over the course of approximately 81 minutes. No one has ever been charged with the theft. The investigation has extended over more than 3 decades and has involved the FBI, Interpol, and numerous private investigators hired by the museum, which continues to offer a $10 million reward for information leading to the recovery of the works. The investigation has, over the years, pointed in various directions, with investigators at various points focusing on connections to the Boston area Irish-American criminal underworld, including individuals associated with Whitey Bulger's Winter Hill Gang. Several individuals with potential knowledge of the theft's circumstances have died violently over the decades since the robbery, either through murders connected to organized crime activity or in other circumstances, taking whatever knowledge they possessed with them. The connection between the Gardner heist and violent criminal networks is a consistent thread in investigative reporting on the case, with some researchers arguing that the works have been used as collateral in criminal financial transactions and moved through criminal networks in ways that make their recovery increasingly complicated. The case illustrates a consistent pattern in high-value art theft cases, in which the difficulty of selling or otherwise monetizing stolen masterpieces drives them into the possession of criminal networks where they become entangled with violence and other criminal enterprises in ways that the original perpetrators may not have anticipated. Number 5. The Stopwatch Gang. Canada's most prolific bank robbers. And their violent legacy. The Stopwatch Gang, so named by law enforcement for the precision timing of their bank robberies, was a Canadian criminal trio consisting of Paddy Mitchell, Stephen Reed, and Lionel Wright, who carried out more than 100 bank robberies across Canada and the United States from the mid-1970s through the early 1980s, netting an estimated $15 million in total proceeds. Their robberies were notable for their speed and organization, typically lasting under 2 minutes, and for their initial policy of avoiding violence toward bank employees and customers, a policy that distinguished them from many other robbery crews and contributed to a certain notoriety that in some media coverage bordered on romanticization. The gang evaded law enforcement for years through a combination of careful planning, rapid movement between jurisdictions, and the use of sophisticated disguises, but the operational discipline that had initially kept their crimes non-violent eventually broke down as the pressures of sustained criminal life, combined with drug use that had become significant within the gang by the early 1980s, eroded the control they had previously maintained. Stephen Reed's later life following his eventual arrest, conviction, and release from prison took a violent turn when he carried out a drug-fueled robbery in Victoria, British Columbia, in 1999 that resulted in a high-speed pursuit and a shooting incident in which Reed fired at pursuing police vehicles, injuring a police officer before being apprehended. Reed was convicted and sentenced to 18 years in prison for the 1999 offenses. The arc of the Stopwatch Gang story from disciplined non-violent robbery to the eventual breakdown into drug-influenced violence illustrates a pattern documented in criminological research on career criminals, in which the lifestyle associated with sustained criminal enterprise, including drug use, the constant stress of potential capture, and the increasingly desperate measures required to maintain both criminal operations and personal finances, tends to erode the operational discipline that may initially have kept violence out of a crew's methods. Number 6. The Antwerp Diamond Heist. Inside an unsolved $100 million theft. The Antwerp Diamond Heist of February 2003, in which thieves made off with an estimated $100 million in diamonds, gold, jewelry, and other valuables from the Antwerp Diamond Center vault in Belgium, was immediately recognized as one of the largest diamond thefts in history and became the subject of an international investigation involving Belgian federal police, Interpol, and law enforcement agencies across multiple countries. The heist involved a crew led by Leonardo Notarbartolo, an Italian jewel thief who had rented an office in the Diamond Center building for approximately 3 years prior to the robbery in order to study the vault's security systems and procedures, demonstrating a level of patient planning that investigators found remarkable. The gang used sophisticated techniques to defeat multiple security systems and accessed approximately 120 of the vault's 160 safe deposit boxes over what was believed to have been a weekend when the building was largely unoccupied. Notarbartolo was arrested after police found evidence at a dumping site where some of the gang's materials had been disposed of, and he was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison, but most of his associates were never identified or prosecuted and the vast majority of the stolen goods were never recovered. The investigation into where the proceeds went revealed connections to criminal networks across Europe, and evidence suggested that diamonds from the heist had been dispersed through criminal channels across multiple countries. The violent dimension of the Antwerp case emerged not from the heist itself, which was carried out without direct physical confrontation with victims, but from the subsequent investigations into the networks through which the proceeds were dispersed, which intersected with organized criminal enterprises whose methods routinely included violence in resolving disputes over shares and proceeds, a pattern consistent with what investigators had documented in other major heist cases where the disposal of large quantities of valuable goods requires engagement with criminal networks for whom violence is a standard operating tool. Number 7. The United California Bank Burglary. A corporate espionage heist gone wrong. The 1972 burglary of the United California Bank in Laguna Niguel, California, which at the time was described as the largest bank burglary in American history, netting an estimated $8 million from safe deposit boxes, was carried out by a crew with connections to organized crime and demonstrated the pattern by which major heist operations generate subsequent violence as the criminal networks involved in financing, planning, and profiting from large-scale theft turn on each other over. The division of proceeds. The burglary required sophisticated planning and equipment, with the crew drilling into the vault over a weekend, and the scale of the operation indicated prior knowledge of what the vault contained. The subsequent investigation identified connections to organized crime figures, and the eventual prosecutions revealed a criminal network whose internal conflicts over the proceeds included threats and violence directed at those believed to have failed to deliver agreed shares. The case preceded by only a few years several other major American heist operations that followed similar patterns, with the initial criminal event generating a trail of subsequent crimes as perpetrators and their associates attempted to manage the legal, financial, and interpersonal consequences of having participated in an operation of that scale. Law enforcement investigators who have studied the patterns of major heist cases consistently note that the period immediately following a large robbery is often the most dangerous for those involved, as the combination of large sums of money, multiple individuals with competing claims, and the stress of law enforcement investigation creates conditions in which violence between co-conspirators becomes significantly more likely than violence during the robbery itself. Number 8. The Millennium Dome Diamond Raid. A foiled heist and its criminal network. On November 7, 2000, a gang of armed robbers made an audacious attempt to steal the Millennium Star Diamond and several other high-value gems from a De Beers exhibition at the Millennium Dome in London, using a JCB earthmover to smash through the exhibition's security barriers and carrying nail guns, sledgehammers, and smoke grenades to facilitate their escape by speedboat on the Thames River. The operation was foiled because investigators from the flying squad, which had received intelligence about the planned robbery weeks earlier and had been conducting covert surveillance of the gang, were waiting inside the dome disguised as cleaners and other workers when the robbery attempt was made, apprehending the robbers in the act. The gang's leader, Robert Adams, and his associates were convicted of conspiracy to rob and received substantial prison sentences. The investigation revealed that the gang had connections to a broader network of professional criminals in southeast England whose activities included robbery, drug trafficking, and other serious offenses, and whose methods in resolving disputes and managing threats routinely included violence. Several individuals associated with the network connected to the Millennium Dome gang had criminal records that included violent offenses, and law enforcement intelligence indicated that the planning of the robbery had involved associates with significant histories of violence, reflecting the consistent pattern in which professional robbery crews at the upper end of the criminal hierarchy maintain connections to individuals willing to use violence as a tool of criminal enterprise management, even when the specific operation being planned is intended to be carried out without direct physical harm to victims. Number 9. The Securitas Depot Robbery. Britain's largest cash robbery and its violent aftermath. The robbery of the Securitas Cash Depot in Tunbridge, Kent, England, on the night of February 21 and into the early morning hours of February 22, 2006, in which approximately £53 million was stolen, was at the time and remains the largest cash robbery in British history, surpassing even the Brinks Mat robbery of 1983 in terms of the monetary value taken. The robbery was carried out by a gang that kidnapped the depot manager, Colin Dixon, and his family, holding them at gunpoint while using Dixon's identity and cooperation to gain access to the depot, where staff were then overpowered and restrained while the gang loaded cash into vehicles over the course of several hours. The kidnapping and prolonged detention of Dixon, his wife, and his young child at gunpoint, with the family subjected to significant physical and psychological terror throughout, meant that unlike some heist cases where violence remains potential rather than actual, the Securitas robbery involved direct and sustained violence against the victims from its inception, making it a case that illustrates the deliberate use of violence as an operational tool rather than an unexpected consequence of a property crime. The investigation, which was one of the largest in British criminal history, eventually resulted in the arrest and conviction of numerous individuals involved in the robbery and its planning. Leah Russia, Jetmir Bukpapa, Stuart Royal, and others received substantial prison sentences, while the gang's leader, Paul Allen, and a key figure named Mult Hussein were also convicted. A significant quantity of the stolen cash was recovered in subsequent police operations. The case demonstrated the deliberate and calculated nature of violence in professional robbery operations at the highest level of criminal organization, where the kidnapping and terrorizing of a victim and his family was planned and executed as a central element of the operational methodology rather than arising as an unintended consequence of a confrontation during the robbery itself. Number 10. The Hollywood Canteen Robbery and the Massacre. That followed among the most violent conclusions to a heist operation in American criminal history was the case of the Carr brothers, Reginald and Jonathan, who carried out a series of robberies in Wichita, Kansas, in December 2000 that culminated in what became known as the Wichita Massacre, one of the most horrific violent crimes in Kansas history. The brothers had been committing a series of increasingly violent robberies and assaults in the Wichita area in the weeks leading up to the worst of their crimes, using robbery as their primary criminal activity while demonstrating an escalating willingness to use extreme violence against their victims that went far beyond what any rational assessment of their criminal objectives would require. On the night of December 14, 2000, Reginald and Jonathan Carr forced their way into a house in Wichita where 5 young people were present, held them captive for several hours during which they were subjected to extreme violence and sexual assault, forced them to withdraw cash from ATM machines in a series of trips that combined robbery with ongoing captivity, and then drove them to a soccer field where all 5 were shot in the head. 4 of the 5 died. The 5th, a young woman, survived after the bullet she was shot with was deflected by a hair clip, and her survival and subsequent testimony formed a critical part of the prosecution's case against the brothers. Both Reginald and Jonathan Carr were convicted of multiple counts of first-degree murder and other charges in 2002 and were sentenced to death in Kansas. The case went through extensive appellate proceedings, including a significant Kansas Supreme Court decision that was subsequently overturned by the United States Supreme Court in 2016 in a ruling related to the jury instructions used during sentencing, with the case being returned for resentencing proceedings. The Wichita Massacre case illustrated the extreme end of the continuum along which robbery and violence coexist. A case in which robbery was simply one element of an episode of criminal violence in which the perpetrators demonstrated a complete absence of the restraint or moral limitation that would have prevented the murders, making it one of the most stark examples of how the commission of robbery crimes, when carried out by individuals without any meaningful internal brake on violence, can escalate to mass murder with devastating consequences for the victims and the communities affected. Subscribe for more true crime cases.